comes to civil rights, you gotta know the definition. Civil rights and civil liberties are often associated, which leads to confusion. Civil rights are actions taken to create equal conditions for all. It provides equal protection for minority groups such as homosexuals, the disabled, African Americans, and other ethnic groups. Many topics that come up when discussing civil rights are black codes and Jim Crow laws. Black codes were mainly in the South where most slaves were and prohibited slaves from voting, participating in jury sittings, and being at public places. Jim Crow laws is basically the same as black codes, just with the term segregation used. The 13th Amendment basically freed slaves. Meanwhile, the 14th Amendment provided these now free slaves with citizenship, also prohibiting states from denying the privileges of citizenship. Like the description says, the 15th Amendment gave citizens of any color or race the right to vote. These amendments didn't really take action until around the 20th century, where we saw cases like Plessy versus Ferguson. These three amendments didn't necessarily make equal opportunities for blacks.
What? Bro, what are you?
The Equal Protection Clause practically forbids any state from denying a person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Civil Rights Act of 1875 carried out the opposite of what the Jim Crow laws did. It is clear that the Jim Crow laws violated this act, but it took 5 court cases in 1883 to make this apparent. This act allowed equal access for blacks in public places. De facto and de jure are both words derived from the Latin origin. De facto is when the practice of discrimination is a normal thing amongst a group of people or citizens, and de jure is the practice of when discrimination is by law. These words aren't only held to the usage of discrimination, they can be used for many other words. Several years after Dred Scott, Homer Plessy tested the de jure segregation by purposely getting on a Louisiana train, knowing about their segregation laws, and got himself arrested. The Supreme Court decided that the equal but separate accommodations for whites and blacks imposed by Louisiana do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The NAACP stands for the National Association of the Advancement for Colored People. Their goal was to repeal the separate but equal doctrine, and they carried out test cases to challenge segregation amongst schools. The NAACP had made law schools in the South their primary target to challenge segregated schools because they felt as if the judges would understand and the whites wouldn't feel as threatened. The case, Gaines versus Canada, is a prime example. I'll just give you a brief overview of the case. Lloyd Gaines was a graduate of the historically black university, Lincoln University. He applied to University of Missouri Law School and was rejected. That provoked the NAACP to state that having a separate law school wasn't equal. The NAACP further created a strategy that would get all African Americans an equal education. Another one of the cases that argued about segregation in schools was Brown v. Board of Education. Brown argued that separate but equal precedent that was set by Plessy versus Ferguson was unconstitutional due to it violating the 14th Amendment. The court sided with Brown and got rid of separate but equal. The Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1964 can be seen as a big leap forward in the world of civil rights. It banned discrimination in workplaces, preventing the government from funding schools that practice discrimination of any sort, and also established the Equal Opportunity Commission, which helped keep an eye on job discrimination. Like previously stated, the 15th Amendment allowed African Americans to vote, but there was a catch to it. African Americans faced more barriers such as the literacy test, the grandfather clause, and poll taxes, which was later banned through the 24th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally gave them the right to vote without any catches or curveballs. It took a long time for women to get the right to vote, which is the 19th Amendment for those who don't know. The women's rights also featured the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title IX, which banned gender discrimination in higher institutions, such as colleges and law schools. Title IX also force-funded women's sports, requiring women to have just as many sports as men do. One of the most talked about minority groups are Hispanics. Hispanics are the largest and fastest growing minority group since the 1910s Mexican Revolution. Hispanic immigrants are a primary source of cheap labor, and they mainly rely on the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Educational Fund for litigation changes. One of the lesser heard of minority groups are Native Americans. They were the original Americans before their lands was stolen, forcing them to adapt to new languages and cultures. Native Americans have been filing test cases since the 1960s. Back then, discrimination against Asians was very harsh. The Chinese were prohibited from coming to America due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Supreme Court declared that Asians don't pass as white in 1922. The bombing on Pearl Harbor made it worse for the Japanese, German Americans, and Italians, causing them to be imprisoned. Although the LGBT community has had its ups when it came to court cases, they still have some downfalls. President Clinton attempted to eradicate discrimination of gays and lesbians by proposing the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Lawrence versus Texas was a key case for bringing attention to gays. The Rehabilitation Act, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act greatly benefited people with disabilities. The Rehabilitation Act got rid of the number one problem, which was discrimination. This act prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in federal programs. Education for All Handicapped Children Act was mainly an equal rights act that provided children with disabilities the same education as those who weren't disabled. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a law passed in 1990 that requires employers and public facilities to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities and prohibits discrimination against these individuals in employment. Affirmative action was a policy designed to correct the effects of the past discrimination. Most issues that it was dealing with were race or gender related. Most white-collar Americans no longer supported the Democratic Party because African Americans were being chosen over them. The term white-collar means that they're either working in an office or administrative setting.